Hello my friends, in today's video we will take a look at the stabilization on Panasonic A7IV and Sony A7IV. I am making this video mainly to clarify the stabilization testing situation from the A7IV versus S5II comparison, because it is very nuanced and nobody has really shown the whole picture so far. In this video we will take a look at a variety of tests to see whether the S5II stabilization really destroys the A7IV. Before we start, one thing that I would like to clarify is that there is no mode on S5II called Active IS. As far as I understand from the marketing materials, Active IS is the name of the whole stabilization system in the S5II. In the stills mode, I was able to get longer shutter speeds with Panasonic. At 24mm, I was able to get pretty good sharpness at 1 full second. With Sony, I needed about 2/3 of a stop exposures for similar sharpness. That might be partially caused by the shutter, which seems to be significantly softer on Panasonic. Regarding the video stabilization, we will start with the simple part, which is static shots. In this category, the S5II does really well. Wide angles are very stable, 50mm is still fine, and I would say that it is good enough up to about 75mm. Sony A7IV is actually equally good when it comes to the static shots. I can't really say which one is better. I can say that both work very well in this regard. An advantage of the S5II is the IS lock mode, where the images really look like on a tripod. This is intended only for static shots though. On the A7IV you can use active mode, but it is not as effective for static shots. The second discipline is pointing the camera around. I have chosen 50mm focal length for this test. I would still say that the results are very similar and very good with both. Panasonic seems to be a bit more stable at the end of the transition, but I would say that the differences are pretty minor. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the interesting part, which is the walking. At 20mm, Panasonic is significantly better for walking as long as the digital image stabilization on both is turned off. Is it suitable for walking? Sony probably not. With Panasonic, the stability itself is very impressive for IBIS only, but there is a lot of warping in the corners. I'm generally not a fan of walking with camera without a gimbal, but this is not horrible, which is actually a very good result. Once you turn the active mode on Sony and E-stabilization on Panasonic on, the things get interesting. Surprisingly, the A7IV is much more stable at 20mm. This actually looks great, and it is, in my opinion, a very usable footage. I didn't really know that the A7IV can do this, and I am indeed very impressed by the active mode at 20mm. I'm not sure whether the E-stabilization even helps the S5II at 20mm. The footage is probably more stable, but it makes the warping in the corners a lot worse. I would probably leave the E-stabilization off for walking at 20mm. At 24mm, the situation again turns around and the S5II is significantly better with or without digital image stabilization. Here it is probably safe to say that Sony isn't usable for walking at 24mm without digital image stabilization. That is pretty horrible. Active stabilization is working really hard at 24mm, but once the IBIS reaches its limit, the whole image starts jumping around and that looks pretty bad. Panasonic is definitely much more stable. It may actually look better than at 20mm because there is less warping. Again, this is a very impressive result for IBIS only. Is it usable? I will leave that up to you. Much like at 20mm, E-stabilization doesn't really do much and it makes the warping worse. At longer focal lengths, S5II will be significantly better at walking. The difference at 35mm is huge, there is no doubt about that. Sony just makes you dizzy. Panasonic is again very impressive for IBIS only. Unfortunately, the E-stabilization definitely makes things worse at 35mm. It introduces that strobing effect, which is visible with every step. Generally speaking, walking with a camera at 35mm is, in my opinion, not a reasonable thing to do. Just get a gimbal if you need to walk with a 35mm lens. One thing that I would like to add is that if there is a subject in the frame, anything that draws viewers' attention and moves with the camera, the shaking is generally less disturbing. The conclusions are still the same, every focal length and setting just becomes more usable. The crop caused by the digital image stabilization is slightly smaller on Panasonic. On Sony it is 1.1 times, on Panasonic I would say about 1.07 times. One more feature that some of you mentioned in the comments is gyro stabilization on Sony. The A7IV can capture gyro data and use them to stabilize the footage in Catalyst Browse software. It only works at wide angles and it requires high shutter speed. But when it works incredibly well, and it is probably the most effective way of stabilization out there. The crop that it introduces is very significant though. I haven't mentioned it in the review because it is not very convenient to use at the moment, but I think that this might be the future of stabilization. I've only compared the dual stabilization very briefly because I don't have comparable lenses with stabilization for both systems. Static shots at 100mm actually look very similar, and again I am happy with this result. As I mentioned in the comparison, I have recently tested the dual IBIS on Panasonic with 24-105mm f4 and that worked very well even in very difficult situations. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that the conclusion greatly depends on chosen tests. First of all, I would say that both IBIS systems are generally very good. Panasonic is better for long stills exposures by about 1/3 of a stop. Video is more complicated. In situations where you basically need to get rid of the shaking, that typically means static shots and pointing the camera around, you will actually get very similar performance. Panasonic generally has an advantage in situations with bigger movements, typically the walking. Having said that, the A7IV beats the S5 II in one pretty important test, which is walking at ultra-wide angles with active mode on. Sony performed great in this test. Once you get to about 24mm, Panasonic will be significantly better at walking with or without digital stabilization. E-stabilization on Panasonic actually makes the footage look worse in a lot of situations, so I would say that there is a lot of room for improvement in that area. I also hope that camera manufacturers will look more into gyro stabilization options in the future because that seems to have a lot of potential. Overall, I would say that the S5 II has better stabilization than the A7IV, but there are significant nuances as I've explained. There definitely are situations where it is much better, but it won't universally destroy A7IV in every situation, as the walking-only comparisons at 35+mm might suggest. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.